Hey, everybody. Ready? Okay. Hello, everybody. We're going to get started. And we also want to make sure that the folks on Zoom can hear us. So if you could do a thumbs up, we'll know that things are working. We're trying out the hybrid method again. Good evening and welcome to Underwood Conservation District's January Winter Workshop. My name is Tova Tillinghast. I'm the director of Underwood Conservation District, and we really appreciate you being here tonight and taking the time to learn all about pollinators. We're very excited about tonight's presentation with Matthew Shepard. And the owl's on right now, but okay. Matthew Shepard from Xerces Society. We will properly introduce him in just a moment. And we just want to take a moment as well to brag about some of our other events, the rest of the winter workshops that are happening. Okay. We already had a successful workshop on biochar this in December, and it was built on a previous online webinar that we hosted a couple of years ago that's recorded and located on our website. We gathered in person, though, in December to experience the process of burning and creating biochar, and a few of you in this room were there with us. Those of us who were there, I think we were pretty amazed at the process and the outcome. And in about 3 hours, we collected and burned forest slash and wildfire fuels material and created, if I remember right, about 2 cubic yards of biochar, which is now a stable form of carbon storage and also an amendment for future soil building and gardening possibilities. Unfortunately, we did not record that. It was all outdoors. But besides last month's in-person workshop, most of our past winter workshops have been recorded, and they are available on our website under news and events and archived webinars. And you also can find PDF slides, a slide deck for future reference there of those presentations. So you can go back, learn about any of our past topics, including the online biochar webinar that we held a couple years ago. And please feel free to share that with others, with neighbors and friends of yours that may be interested. And also to stay up to date with all of our activities throughout the year, please consider signing up for our newsletter. We have a sign-up sheet going around, and there's a newsletter column, but that's actually misadvertising. We really prefer that you go to our website and sign yourself up. Subscribe for our newsletter there. And that way you can put all your preferences in on your own. So go ahead and sign up for our newsletter. It comes out every other month, and James there has that to pass around. And then as you can see here, we're offering one more winter workshop in February, and it again will be a hybrid format, we expect. That'll be at the Mountain View Grange when James Cassidy speaks about soils. So it's going to be a very great event again. We're looking forward to that. And so again, thank you for being here in person. And if you're not getting the clicker to work, if you're on Zoom tonight, these are just a couple of quick reminders that most of you are probably very familiar with. For those of you in the room, you probably know there's restrooms right behind you in the hallway. Help yourself to snacks and the publications that are here. We do expect to be able to take a few questions throughout the presentation. Matthew's very gracious to accept questions throughout his talk, and that includes folks on Zoom. So we just ask that those of you on Zoom, you can put your question in the chat, and then we'll take a moment to answer those as they come up. And we'll probably ask you to, if you're on Zoom, to go ahead and speak up when I ask you to with your question. All right. So with that, I think we have a couple slides that I wanted to present about Underwood Conservation District. So if you're not familiar with us, we are a local public agency, and we're a clearinghouse for information and a source of project support. We work with the public, with landowners, and other stakeholders. We're locally led. We have a local board of directors, and we're non-regulatory. So we don't enforce rules and laws, but we do try to come out and support your efforts in meeting your own land management goals, but possibly even complying with local laws and regulations that may apply. Generally, we try to keep a neutral stance on controversial issues, and the natural resource issues that we can work with are wide-ranging, and some of them are listed here: habitat restoration, native plants, noxious weeds, water quality and forest health, and a big one these days is wildfire risk reduction. This is our mission: to engage landowners and land users throughout Skamania and West Klickitat counties in the voluntary conservation, enhancement, stewardship, and sustainable use of natural resources. So we were established in Underwood in 1940. That's why we're called Underwood Conservation District. And since then, we've expanded to cover all of Skamania County and Western Klickitat County. So despite the name, we have grown to be much larger than the name, and you can see where we're located here in the state. Pretty large district, and we're pretty excited also to be the only conservation district in Washington state that spans the Cascade Divide. So we really get the best of both worlds with the west side and the east side of the Cascades. You can see a little more zoomed in generally what our district area entails. A lot of this is public land, as you know, with the Gifford Pinchot National Forest and the Mount St. Helens National Monument, but we tend to focus primarily with private landowners and communities along the southern edge of the district. This is a laundry list of all of the different programs that we work on. Again, our natural resource issues are very wide ranging, and we have a lot of different priorities and programs of work and services. So if you have interests in your property or your own community and neighborhood, just let us know and maybe we can work with you on something. This is our current staff, and we have grown just in the last year and a half. So get to know us, come invite us out to your property if you have questions about your property management. And you can see here, we've got a great team. Some of them are here tonight. So before they talk really quickly, I just want to tell you about where our office is. If you haven't seen it, we have a new mural that was painted just last spring. It's called Tune In, and we're located at the Park Center building here in the center of White Salmon in the park. We've had over 100 students visiting the mural and learning about the features in the mural that highlight different wildlife, different flora and fauna of the gorge, and different natural features such as the mountains and the basalt cliffs and the rivers. And we just now, can't quite see it, but there's a interpretive sign now in front of the mural, so you can read all about the mural and the artist, Jessica Vollendorf, who painted that with us. And I have to brag, we're turning 85 in 2025, and here we are. Pretty amazing. So we may not look it, but we're 85. So let's see the next slide. If I can get this to advance, I'm not quite getting the clicker to move. Oh, good point. It's over. Is this you, James? We'll let James talk about the plant sale.
Hi, I'm James. I'm with Underwood Conservation District, and I'm sure many of you are aware, but we are in full swing of our native plant sale. We'll be taking pre-orders up until the end of February. These are all pre-orders. They'll all be picked up at our Tree Fest celebration on March 22nd, right outside our office at the park in White Salmon. It's a great celebration for all things conservation. We have a lot of great partners that kind of show up. A lot of activities. We have food, and we do date of sale single stems too that you can go just walk up and purchase some. Yeah. And for everyone that's here online or in person, we are offering a 20% off discount for any orders made over the next week until next Saturday. When you do your checkout online, you can just put in that code right there. It says native 2025 for the discount. So we'll give you 20% off your order.
When you were a planner and you already bought your stuff, that doesn't.
You can reach out and we can.
That's not.
Yeah. Cool. The other cool thing that we actually started last year is we're in the process of starting a native nursery with the Wind River Trust up in the old Forest Service nursery area. It's just outside of Stabler, Hemlock, just north of Carson, which is a pretty cool situation. So it's out of popular demand. People have been asking for a fall native plant sale. We're actually going to establish or sell more established plants. You can see I'm looking at all these plants. And we'll actually have our second Hemlock Heritage Fest up there this fall. We'll have day of sales for that. We have a lot of activities, a lot of education. It's a great partnership with the Wind River Trust. We're actually working with the Forest Service, Smedley County Noxious Weeds. Humble Roots has been a huge partner in this situation too. So sign up for a newsletter and keep out for information for that, because it's a pretty cool event. We'll have it again this year. It'll be our second annual one.
You can stand just a little further back there, but I can't see your face. Thank you. Perfect.
Very cool. So you asked, like, what are all these native plants for? And we kind of talk about, people buying them, and collaboratively through this past year, we've distributed through purchases and through restoration projects over 14,000 native plants in our area. This year was just done this past year. We were able to do some native plantings along the White Salmon River up in Trout Lake, which has been a fantastic situation, converting back ag land to forest with native plants. As you can see, there's been a lot of work that we've been doing over the past year. So another cool program that we do offer is our food and farm tool library. We added the food aspect to it this past year, which has been a great systematic aspect to everything from cultivating, growing, maintaining, processing, preserving. So we do everything from, food processors and canners and cultivators, and we have a no-till seed drill. All that stuff's linked to our website. We have a huge inventory that goes through all of the things that we do offer. As you can see on here, it says like soil testing. We will be offering soil testing this spring and this next fall for free. So reach out, keep up to date with our newsletter, and there'll be more information as that comes out here over the next month. As you can see, we have like a smaller no-till seed drill. We have some other equipment. We have some moisture meters, some compaction meters, all kinds of really fun stuff. I will be opening back up normal hours down at our farm tool library, which is located at the lower portion of the Mount View Grange. And that'll be starting back up in the first week or two of March, which you can stop down. Open hours will be Wednesday and Friday from noon to 2. Anytime you have any questions, just reach out to me. My card's in the back and all my information's on our website. Oh, yeah. I'm not gonna. Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I am Corey Podolak, and I work at UCD, of course, and I do a lot of the outreach. Oh, yes, I do a lot of the outreach. It's not actually a microphone. But I do the outreach and communication, as well as the yard by yard and the crop talks programs. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about it. Crop talks is great because it's a gathering of farmers across the Columbia on the Washington and Oregon side. We team up with Board Grown Food Network, and they help us to gather farmers that will host events where they talk about their practices and the story of their farm, and then the farmers can collaborate and build a community where they can feed off of each other's information and hopefully produce more food. So this year we ran it through from April to October, and we had 7 farmers that hosted the events and 120 people that attended, and it was very successful. I think everybody really enjoyed it, and just a great way to build community. And then the other program I wanted to talk about is our yard by yard, which is very much in line with this event, and wanted to hopefully drum up some interest. So the program, excuse me, focuses on sustainable gardening practices, and we're trying to benefit local wildlife, conserve water, think about carbon capture, eliminating or reducing chemical use. And the cool thing with the certification is you're creating a patchwork corridor for wildlife to hopefully, wildlife pollinators to be able to travel through. So really you can make a big difference in your backyard. So something that you can feel empowered by. So if you sign up, you also get 2 free trees, potted trees, and a very cool sign so you can brag to your neighbors. So sign up and feel free to ask me questions afterward or check out the checklist online. And then last but not least, I would like to introduce our speaker for this evening. And he is the Director of Outreach and Education for the Xerces Society of Invertebrate Conservation in Portland, Oregon. And Matthew has spent 35 years working with people from diverse communities to create better places for wildlife. Over the last 2 decades, he's helped build pollinator conservation from an obscure issue to a topic of dinner table conversation and wide engagement. Matthew is the author or co-author of numerous articles and other publications, including Attracting Native Pollinators and Gardening for Butterflies. Much of his focus is on supporting neighborhood level efforts, such as pollinator gardens and small habitat projects in parks. He has led the Bring Back the Pollinators campaign and promoted No Mow May and Leave the Leaves initiatives. Excuse me. He learned gardening at his mother's side and has created and maintained wildlife gardens everywhere he has lived. So let's welcome Matthew. Thank you so much.
I have to go and stand in one place.
I apologize that
No, that's all right. I'm normally a roamer. More likely to be doing this this evening. For the sake of everybody, including our
use this,
friends at
this
home.
arrow because this is not working.
Yeah, that's
Thank
all right.
you.
I'll just move that out of the way so I don't fiddle with it, because that's the other thing I do is I fiddle. Okay. Good. Well, good. Just making sure it matches, because I can't see the screen when I stand here. So I want to make sure that I know that I'm going to be talking to the right thing. So thank you so much for inviting me here this evening, Tova and Corey and James. I live on the west side of Portland because that's where the Xerces Society is based, in Portland. As you heard, my background is I've done a lot of things over a lot of years, and I'm also British. I'm just being upfront, okay? I don't want you to be confused about that. I happened to meet an American when I was in Africa and chased her halfway across the world, and ended up here in Portland. I've been here for 26 years now. And somehow I still sound British, and I don't try to keep my accent. I don't try to lose it. It's just how I talk. And when I'm here, people think I'm British. And when I'm in Britain, people think I'm not. So there we go. To give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about, if I can just, there, the technology works. Good, good, good. I'm going to introduce you to the Xerces Society with a few slides. I'll talk a bit about the diversity of native bees and what they need, so that when you can go and look at your yard, you're like, oh, you know, you can like take those bee eyes out with you and begin to be able to assess your own yard. I'm going to talk about some of the things you can do in your own garden. I will touch on plants, but that's not what I'm going to talk about a lot, simply because there are so many great sources of plant information, including, is that webinar available via your website, Native Plant Landscape? You can come to the UCD website and learn lots of great stuff. And also because everybody's yard is different, right? Different exposure, different moisture, different soils, sun, shade, wind, whatever. Which means that every one of you is going to have slightly different conditions and need specific plants. And then there's also some wrap up at the end of that. So the Xerces Society, we are an environmental nonprofit. Our mission is to protect the natural world through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. We are named Xerces after the Xerces blue butterfly, which is one of the first butterflies in North America known to go extinct because of human activity. Used to live on the San Francisco Peninsula, around the Golden Gate area and down the Pacific coast through what's now the Sunset District, which is like a super cool place to live, but that's where the butterfly used to live. And as that city expanded, the butterfly lost its habitat and disappeared, and it was last seen flying in 1943. And this image is a photograph of a page from, it's the only book I'm aware of from that era that shows the Xerces blue butterfly. And you can see it was published in 1927. And, 15 years later, that butterfly was on the brink and then soon disappeared. So at the most basic level, our work is to try and stop more extinctions and more disappearances. Despite the fact that the Xerces has been gone for 80 years, it's really interesting because even last year it was back in the news. There has just been a project to try and, they're calling it restoration or anyway, they're trying to recreate butterfly by introducing another butterfly and hoping that it will change itself into what we used to have. I think it's fabulous because they did all the habitat work. So they've got this amazing habitat now. So there's lots of good benefits that have come from that. I'm not sure that they're going to get the butterfly back. But also bizarrely, actually it wasn't bizarre, it was just unexpected. At the Met Gala, Uma Thurman walked in this amazing sculptural dress that had like Xerces butterflies flying around. And it was quite remarkable. And if you kind of go online, I'm sure you'll find images of it. Anyway, Xerces Society, I'd say we are an environmental nonprofit. We do lots of different things. We are based in Portland, so our main office is. We've just hit the threshold of 100 staff, which is mind-blowing because when I started, there was 4 of us working out of the corner of one room or corner of one small building in Southeast Portland, and now we're like 100 people in 25 states. Which is remarkable since we're all focused on bugs, and bugs are kind of icky, It's not always been a terribly popular topic. Internally, we're divided into teams, as you might imagine. So we have a pollinator conservation team, an endangered species team, an outreach team, and a pesticide reduction team, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But our work is basically in 4 areas, which is habitat creation, because if we're not changing conditions on the ground, what's the hope for wildlife in general? We do pesticide reduction. That's something that not everybody is, not every conservation group is really into. But for us, it's fundamentally important because so many of the pesticides are insecticides. And you can create all the thousands of acres of habitat you like, but if they're toxic, they're not great for insects. We also do work on species protection. Just last month, there was an announcement about the monarch butterfly being proposed for listing under the Endangered Species Act as threatened. That's something we started on 20 years ago, gathering data. 10 years ago, we submitted the petition. And so some of these things take an awful long time to complete the arc. And it's going to be another year or 2, maybe longer until that one is finally resolved. And then we also do research because everything we do is underpinned by evidence. We don't go out and make recommendations for what people can do unless we're confident that it's the right recommendation. We don't go out and campaign to protect a species until we have the evidence of the decline and what it needs and what can be done. So we are a science-based and evidence-based organization. We're also, I said we've reached 100 staff, which is pretty remarkable, but we're actually bigger than that because of partnerships. We work with with farmers and public land managers and schools and gardeners and park managers. Communities all over the country are involved with the work. And so a lot of what we achieve, things like the habitat, you know, we can tot up millions of acres of habitat that have been created on farms, parks, community gardens, etc., etc. But we don't own that land. That's hard work by our partners. We're supporting them, providing them with information, sometimes able to provide them with plants and so on. But it's partnerships at the heart of our work. And we are donor supported. If you are already a donor, I know there's one or two in this room, which is awesome. We're so appreciative for what you do to support our work. Without the funding, we wouldn't be able to do anything. Without that funding, I wouldn't be here this evening. So thank you so much if you are a Xerces supporter or a donor already. And if not, maybe you'd like to consider that by the time we finish this evening. Okay, so that's the end of the shameless self-promotion part. Pollinator diversity. Do I have to say what a pollinator is? It's an animal that moves pollen around and keeps the landscape looking beauty and helps feed us and support all sorts of wildlife. If you look globally, pollinators can be pretty big. There's a lemur in Madagascar that weighs about 10 pounds. And because it feeds on flowers, it's a pollinator. There are birds that are pollinators, you know, there are bats in the southwest in the deserts. There's at least, I think 2 species of bats that help pollinate the cacti, and there's a dove. But on the whole, most of the birds that are pollinators are hummingbirds. You know, we have two, three, depends on where you are. We have several species of hummingbirds in this area. But the huge majority of pollinators are insects, going about their business, doing their work, and we're just not really noticing them. They're just out there. And the major groups going from top left across, butterflies and moths, probably we see those, we recognize those. Flies. Flies can be really important pollinators, not all flies. Just some of them. I mean, anyway, I could get deep into flies and I won't. On the bottom, beetles, again, like flies, many beetles are not pollinators, but some are. And then wasps. Now, wasps are wonderful, but some of them are pollinators, some are not. And then we have bees. And of all of those, bees are recognized as being the most important single group of pollinators because of 3 things that they do. One of which is they collect and transport pollen. Of those other insects, they go to flowers. They maybe go to a flower because they're looking for food. Sometimes that's the flower itself. There's one thing about beetles. Often beetles are eating the flowers themselves, but it's known as mess and spoil pollination because they're in the flower, rummaging around, the pollen gets stuck on them, and then they go and find another flower, and pollen gets transferred. But bees are actively collecting and transporting pollen. And the reason why they do that is because they take it back to their nest and they use it to feed their young. And this means that they're incredibly efficient at carrying that pollen around, and which means that not much of it falls off, but just enough of it gets transferred to another flower to be an efficient form for that flower to reproduce, basically. And the third thing, and I'm not sure bees know this, but it's what people call flower constancy. When a bee has worked out how to manipulate a flower to effectively and efficiently and quickly get that pollen from it and drink the nectar, it goes to a flower of the same species and the same species and the same flower. And so that little bit of pollen that falls off the bee each time goes right around between the right species. Butterflies, kind of flighty creatures, they'll go from one flower to a completely different one, and they might carry pollen, but if it doesn't get to the right flower, it's not pollination. But sometimes it is. And so all of those other insects, the flies, the butterflies, the moths, beetles, wasps, etc., and more. There's some speculation that maybe slugs help pollinate one or two low-growing plants, but there's so much we don't know. It all helps with pollination. It all keeps our environment healthy, keeps our farm crops abundant and bountiful, keeps our grocery store shelves full. But bees are the ones that are considered to be most important because they're collecting pollen and they're going from one flower to another at the same one. Now, bees. When I say bees, you may first think of honeybees, okay? And that's like our stereotypical bee. The queen, the hive structure, the honeycomb, etc., etc., etc. But despite that, honeybees are not at all a typical bee. There are very few bees that live in such a large colony, make honey, have a social caste, etc., etc. This is probably not a typical person as well. So honeybees are hugely important to our economy and our agriculture. Probably without bees, we wouldn't have the agriculture that we do now. You know, you can go west of here into the Willamette Valley and you'll see all the berries. You go east and you hit the apple. You go just south up the, no, that's south, isn't it? Up the Hood Valley, you know, where we all do the Fruit Loop. You know, we go out and we find our old varieties of apples and so on. You know, a lot of that relies upon the honeybee. And the honeybee is beset by all sorts of problems, you know, pesticides and diseases and parasites and problems with nutrition. And from the beekeeping industry, low honey prices has been a problem over the years too. And despite everything you may have read, and you keep reading about honeybees being endangered, they're not. I just have to be upfront. They're not endangered. They're facing all sorts of problems. But thanks to the hard work of beekeepers, we still have millions of hives of honeybees in this country. The figure I have on the screen says 2.92 million, and that's from a couple of years ago. There's been some survey published not so long ago that suggests it may be 3.5 million or more, but there's also a lot of debate about how that number come up with. So we don't know exactly at the moment just how many hives there are, but we do have something in the region of 3 million hives just in this country. And it's also worth saying that the honeybee is not native to this country. It is domesticated livestock, essentially. And so despite its importance, when it comes to conservation of our biodiversity, we need all the other bees that are out there. And just a quick scamper through an idea of the diversity of bees. Top left going across, we have bumblebees, and then mining bees, which often are just brown and drab and we don't notice. And then we have metallic sweat bees, which are like these incredible flying jewels. And we have tiny sweat bees. I mean, they are called small sweat bees. I don't know if you can see those two bees are on, that's actually the same species of flower, and that gives you a sense of the difference in scale. Some of the metallic sweat bees are, I'm doing it in front of the camera, you know, 3/4 of an inch long, maybe. And the tiny sweat bees can be 1/8 of an inch, 1/10 of an inch, just these tiny little, when you're moving around, you barely see them on the flowers. And then on the bottom row, we have the striped sweat bees that these days are often called furrow bees now. They're kind of nondescript, but they do have distinct stripes on them. We have sunflower bees that have, you know, the back legs, when they're heavy load of pollen, it looks like they're carrying around candy. That's a candy floss. That's the wrong name. That's the British name, isn't it? Cotton candy. There we go. Looks like they're just back from the county fair with like big old cotton candy on their back legs. And then we have the longhorn bees, so-called because the males have the extraordinarily long antennae. And we have small carpenter bees that again are 1/2 an inch or 1/4 an inch long, just dark. But when you get close to them, it's like they're bottle green, and they're super shiny, glossy. We have leafcutter bees that carry their pollen on the underside of their body. So they have skinny back legs, but this really hairy underside that carry the pollen. We have the mason bees, and there's a good chance you've come across mason bees, or also called blue orchard bees. We have squash bees that specialize in only eating the pollen, collecting the pollen from squash flowers. We have the nomad bee, that red one on the yellow flower on the far side, and that one cheats. That doesn't make its own nests. That's one of a group of bees known as kleptoparasites, and it lays its eggs in the nests of other bees. That one typically lays them on the mining bees. It's the second bee I showed you on the other slide. And then we have polyester bees on the bottom, and yellow-faced bees, again, are super tiny, and you probably think were a wasp if you saw them. And then you have like really cute bees. All of these bees, the females make the nests, and I'll come to that shortly. And the males, when the males are around, they don't have a nest. So what do they do at night? Well, they find a plant to sleep on, and they lock their mandibles, their jaws, onto a plant, and they just hang out there, just sleeping away the night. And then the last one on the bottom right is one of the non-native bees that we have around here. It's a carder bee, a wool carder bee, European species. It arrived in New England probably in a plant because they will nest inside plant stems. And then over a period of about 20 years, somehow got from the Northeast all the way across the country. So it's a plant that you'll probably find in your garden around here now. That one was in my front garden. And they scrape downy hairs off hairy leaves with which they use to make their nests. This is why they're called a wool carder bee. And so hairy plants like lamb's ear, if you have that, you'll find these bees will just stick solidly to that plant. That was a scamper through. If you start looking more, you'll find way more bees. In the United States, we have more than 3,600 species of bees. In Washington, there's more than 600, and it's probably closer to 700 species in the state. Here in the Hood River White Salmon area, I would expect you're probably going to find 100 to 150 species of bees if you start looking in all the gardens. And in a single garden, you could easily have 30 or 40 species of bees. And that figure is based on my own yard, because I'm nerdy enough to have started counting them. And my garden, honestly, is not really, well, my front garden is smaller than this room. And I've recorded 30 plus species of bees in that small area. And the 80 figure, there's a project run by Oregon State University that has been doing detailed surveys in gardens in Portland. And they found more than 80 species of bees have been recorded in one native plant garden in Northeast Portland. Again, not a big plot, but remarkable diversity. So, natural history. It's like, what do these bees need? How do they live? The life cycle of our native bees is just like you might have for a butterfly. They lay an egg, the egg hatches into a little squirmy thing that eats. After a little while, that squirmy thing transforms into the pupa, and then the adult comes out. That's the same as you might expect for a butterfly. So it's referred to as complete metamorphosis. That life's transformation can take up to about a year for most of these bees. And most of our bees are solitary. So again, I was saying how honeybees are not typical. Most of our bees are solitary. One female is making her own nest. And she makes that nest, she creates a few brood cells within that nest, then she forages and she puts food into that brood cell. And you'll see the photograph on the far side as I'm standing here, the right-hand side. You see that's a brood cell, and you can see that little yellow ball developing. That's the nectar and pollen that female is bringing in. When she's supplied with enough food, then she lays an egg on it. And the next photograph, you can see there's that little kind of white sausage. That's the bee egg. And then at that point, she seals that cell, and she won't meet her offspring. There are some problems with so many species. there's no such thing. I can't say they all do this and they all do that, or they never do that, and they never. They're all slightly different. So there are some that do meet their offspring, but the great majority will never meet their offspring because they seal that cell and then they go on and make another cell. But that egg will hatch after about a week. The larvae will come out and it's like the ultimate couch potato because its couch is its potato. And it just eats its way through that food supply in that brood cell. And when it's eaten that brood cell, eaten the food, which might take 2 or 3 weeks, that larvae will transform into the pupa, will develop and take on that adult form, at which point it remains dormant and will remain dormant for the rest of the year. This particular example is a mining bee, and it's a bee that's normally active relatively early in the year. A lot of them are active in April and May, and they frequently are nesting in lawns. Some people refer to them as lawn bees because they start finding these little mounds of dirt in their lawn with bees coming and going. Once the female has made her nest, she dies. She'll have laid 20 or 30 eggs, maybe each in a brood cell. And then the next year is when her offspring will emerge out of the ground, will dig their way back out and go back to completing their life cycle. So what do bees need to complete their life cycle? They need flowers. It's like, duh, they're bees, they need flowers. They will drink nectar from more or less anything that's accessible. Many bees will take pollen from a wide range of flowers, but once they've found a flower, they tend to specialize on one flower, but they're not too picky. But there are a number of bees, and maybe 15% of our bee species are kind of picky, and they will need pollen from one particular species of flower. And so with all of that, that's why we try and make sure we have a diversity of flowers in our gardens. About 70% of our bee species are like that mining bee. They nest in the ground. That photograph is a lawn with mining bee nests popping out of it. That particular one was Oregon City, edge of Oregon City, a home orchard. We went out there because they telephoned us and said, "We got all these bees, you want to come and have a look?" And we're like, "Yeah, we're nerds. Of course we want to come and have a look." So we went out there and we sat there and the sky was just humming with bees. And we did a rough count. And in a square, go back a bit so people at home can see, in a square foot of land, in a square foot, we counted between 20 and 30 bee nest entrances, which meant that a rough calculation was there was about 50,000 bee nests in that home orchard, and they were just buzzing around us, and it was quite remarkable. But what happens underground varies from one bee species to another. Sometimes the nests are only 4 or 6 inches deep. Sometimes they will go down 18 inches, 2 feet or deeper. And the structure will vary with the species, sometimes really simple, sometimes incredibly complex. Another really important element that bees need for nesting is dead trees, old stems, hollow twigs. About 30% of our bees, including leafcutter bees and mason bees, yellow-faced bees, nest in little tunnels. And so they will make a series of brood cells down that tunnel. The 2 illustrations there show the upper one is a leafcutter bee. The leafcutter bee takes really neat pieces, very specifically shaped pieces of leaves back to its nest, and then stitches them together with a bit of saliva to make these. If you ever get to see them, it looks a bit like a tiny little cigar. And inside that little cigar is the food and the egg and the developing bee. And then the lower illustration is of a mining bee, a mason bee. And it divides up that tunnel with walls of mud. That's why it's called a mason bee. The same way the leaf cutter is called a leaf cutter because it cuts leaves. mason bee makes its walls with mud. And you'll see, take the tunnel, wall, food, egg, wall, food, egg, wall, food, egg. And then next year, those bees at the back of the tunnel have to work their way out. So typically the ones at the front emerge first. And then the other thing that these bees need, they need nesting supplies. They need those materials. They need access to wet soil. They need leaf pieces. This is a leafcutter bee. You can tell by that leaf it's taking in. And this is one of the unusual leafcutter bees because it doesn't nest in like a twig tunnel. It nests in a hole in the ground. But there are all sorts of different things that they need depending on the species. So that's the third element of, they need flowers, they need the nest sites, and some bees need the nesting materials. And then completely different bumblebees. They are a social bee. We have about 50 species of bumblebees in the country, around 12 or 15 in this region. And they nest in a small cavity. Like the ideal space for a bumblebee is probably like an old chipmunk's nest or a mouse nest, a small rodent's nest, because they find a small cavity, and if it's already lined with fur and leaves and moss and all snug and nice, they'll be really happy in there. They're not like honeybees because they don't make a huge comb, and honeybees make all that honey because they want to keep their nests alive through periods when there's no flowers. So that's a nest that'll live for years and years and years. Bumblebees make an annual nest. So the queens overwinter as solitary, and in late winter and early spring emerge from where they hide, which is underneath leaf litter in tussocks of grass, buried themselves into an inch or two into the soil, and they will come out and look for a nest site. You'll see them in going around. If you see a bumblebee and it's like zigzagging around and then dropping down to the ground and it's kind of sniffing around and then going off, and that's a queen looking for a nest. You'll see this around. And when they found the nest, then they do make a series of waxen cells that are kind of pot-shaped. Food in there, eggs, and then they go on and they go on, they go on. And then when the first kids emerge, they become helpers. And over the next few months, the nest will grow. And depending on the species, you might have a few dozen or maybe a few hundred. But most bumblebee nests are not very big. And then at the end of summer, they die.
Question online.
Yes.
Someone asked about the bees that inhabit twigs and stems and branches. They asked, when do those bees tend to emerge?
It depends on the species. I'm afraid it's one of the ones where there's no simple answer, because different species of bees are active at different times of the year. With the stem nesting bees, the mason bees emerging in March and April are about the earliest one. But you can have some of these bees will be active all the way through to August. And species will be active, most species will be active for about 6 to 8 weeks. And it's a little awkward, because there's no, I can't say, oh, in June you can do this, or in the second year you can do that. But I will talk a little bit more about stems and the timing of that. And just to give you an idea of the nesting, these are the bees I showed you earlier. And you can see how many of these are ground nesting or the tunnel nesting or social in the case of that bumblebee. The one that's ground in square brackets, that's because it's a male bee. So it's not actually doing the hard work, okay, but that species still relies upon the ground. And again, here I made the leaf cutter. I gave that saying like ground in recognition that some species will nest in the ground, but most are tunnel nesting in a hollow twig or similar. And then again, those sleeping ones are guys, so they don't do the work. And then the other one is the kleptoparasite that lays its eggs in the nests of a ground nesting mining bee. But that's just to give you a sense of, and although I was counting it up, I was like, well, does it actually hit the 30-70 kind of split? And luckily it did, because these bees are not necessarily truly representative of the entire diversity. These are bees that you're likely to see in your garden. That's why I have these up here. And if you want to learn more and more and more about bees, there are some great books out there. There's also all sorts of websites and such like. Attracting Native Pollinators covers all sorts of stuff. Bees in your backyard is really good if you want to know more about the bees specifically, helping identify and know more about their biology. The common bees of Western North America is more like a field guide. It's really cool to have a field guide to bees now. This is wonderful. And then Buzz is just a really great romp through all sorts of stuff about bees and pollinators from I think Thor is he's a Washington-based writer, so a lot of what he talks about is up here in the Northwest. Okay, I want to move on to conservation. I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm probably taking too long, so I will try and speed up a bit. When we get to bee conservation, I do have to say that there is this thing where beekeeping and bee conservation don't quite mesh up, and beekeeping is not necessarily bee conservation. And the reason why I say that is because bee conservation really focuses on habitat. So having a backyard hive is great. You know, I mean, if you want an intimate relationship with a fascinating insect, I can't think of a better way to do it, except maybe if you have your own ant nest, you know, because honeybees are incredible. But if you want conservation, we need to make sure that the plants are there, the pesticides are reduced. You know, we need to make sure that our landscape can support the bees, can feed and support the bees that are out there. And having a backyard hive, all you're really doing is bring another box, another 20 or 30,000 bees into a landscape that's already impoverished. And those honeybees can also compete directly with our native bees. There are lots of different ways in which they do compete directly. And given the diversity of flowers in our landscapes, we really do need the diversity of bees to support those flowers. It's not a one bee fits all kind of situation. So I just have to hit on that point that bee conservation focuses on the habitat. We're providing what the bees need, the flowers that they need, those nest sites and the shelter that they need, the pesticide-free environment. We need to focus on protecting existing areas and creating new ones and enhancing areas that we already have. If we look around our landscapes, and where I live on the west side of the Portland metro area, it's like a natural area. You're like, ah, but out here, it's like, I'm just like, my drive down this evening was wonderful. I'm like, oh, these oaks, how beautiful. So some of the stuff, but we really do need to protect our natural areas because they are the foundation. They're the kind of the reservoirs, the refuges where our native bees can be established and can come out and repopulate areas. And whether that's a oak savanna or a prairie or a riparian area or a park over your back fence, you know, there's lots of natural areas out there that we can be protecting and managing. And then we have these kind of unnatural areas, all these little piecemeal bits and pieces through our built up through our towns, roadsides and parks and school playing fields and, you know, bioswales, the stormwater and utility easements and riparian areas with snags. I don't know, do you have any green roofs in White Salmon? I don't know if you do. I mean, roofs can be fantastic habitat. Bees, I know it's like the bees fly. Yeah, I know that, but they fly up. You know, there are records of bees 20, 30 plus stories up on some buildings. And so then that's another area that we consider. And of course, our own personal home gardens. And the reason why your patch is important, and it may not seem like your yard is very big, could have an impact, But your patch is one more piece that can go to support bees throughout our neighborhoods, throughout our towns, throughout the landscape. Because, you know, what you do in your yard could be providing the flowers that supports the bees that are nesting in that snag over by the creek, you know. What you do, you might have the bare ground in your yard that will provide the nesting site for the bees that can then go and feed on the roadsides where the flowers are. So all of our areas are connected. Bees connect us all. And this is just a illustration that shows how different bees can move around through an area and dip into the garden and the park and the community garden and the roadside and the wetland and the ditch. You know, all these little pieces that add up to support these little animals. I know I said bees fly. Some bees don't fly very far. Some bees don't fly more than 100 yards. I know in Portland, the city blocks are 200 feet long. So that's like, you know, a bee could fly 1.5 blocks. And so that's the other reason why it's really important that what we do is everywhere, and why what you do in your garden is so significant, because we're beginning to put the plants, the nest sites, bringing that wildness back into our landscapes and can support the bees. When we often talk about wildlife, we talk about corridors, you know. Yeah, big animals need corridors. Bees, butterflies, flies, beetles, all these pollinators, they move across the landscape in a much more diffuse way. And so they will find your yard and they will benefit from it. Okay, flowers. We know they need flowers. I'm not going to talk much about flowers. As I said earlier, I can't answer all your flower questions, and there's already great sources of information and advice from the Conservation District who can answer your questions about what plants. Retain what we have, create new and native. Native plants are really fundamentally important to support our native species. There is significant body of research now that shows native bees are more abundant and more diverse when they have native plants. If you want to think about butterflies and moths, the work from Doug Tallamy, and I saw there was a copy of Doug's book at the back there, Bringing Nature Home. The work that he did in Delaware is astonishing at understanding the importance of native trees and shrubs to support butterflies and moths. And if you look at it, I forget what the figures are, but it's like an order of magnitude more species and abundance that you get from having native plants. And that's because the caterpillars need the right food to eat. And there's other evidence from Europe, for example. The Royal Horticultural Society in Britain did a series of trials where they had native plants and almost native plants and complete not native plants. And the diversity and abundance of insects was much greater on the native plants. And that included bugs and beetles and grasshoppers and all sorts of things. So native plants are at the core of any wildlife garden. The things to consider in particular for supporting bees is the color. Bees have really good color vision. Like they see almost as wide a spectrum, probably as wide a spectrum of color as us. But you know how we see the rainbow? Bees would not see the red part of the rainbow. The colors they see are kind of shifted. And so they see ultraviolet, for example, which we don't see. So to them, flowers shimmer in the sunshine in ways that we can't imagine. But they don't really see red. To them, red and green, it's like being colorblind, red-green colorblind. So you can imagine how difficult it is to find a red flower against the green leaf. So bees don't really go for red. Diversity is good because there are so many different types of bees out there. And if you can have 3 or 4 different types of flowers in bloom at any one season, then that's a really good foundation to start with. Bloom period, our early bumblebees can be out in well, some might even appear on a warm day in January, but typically it's February and into March. And so that's when they're going to be coming out. And so we can start thinking about what flowers we can be providing for them. And that will go all the way through to August and September. And sometimes you might see them active later, but it's not that easy to find plants that bloom in October or November. So at that point, it's just like they just have to fend for themselves. Native plants are definitely preferable. And then drought tolerance. I mean, I'm sure this district from west to east, you have a huge rain transition. For all of us, you know, we're finding summers are hotter, drier, longer. So we are thinking a lot more about drought tolerance now. We do have conversations at work about, well, should we start growing plants that aren't technically native from this area? You know, should we be helping plants come north because they might be able to cope better with the drier conditions? It's a headache, but it's some of the things that we have to consider. Just going to quickly run through some suggestions for plants from the late winter, early spring and through. And the upper row is for the west side, the lower row is for the east side. Okay. Willows. The west side willow, Schuyler's willow is a good one. East side is the Arroyo willow. We have the flowering currants, the red flowering currant and the golden currant. We have lupins. You've got broadleaf lupin at the top and silvery lupin at the bottom. And then we've got things like Douglas spirea. I always think steeplebrush is such a nice name that I like to call it steeplebrush. There isn't really necessarily a west side alternative, but there are things like purple sage. And then Phacelia, it's great everywhere. There are goldenrods, but west side you might want Canada goldenrod, east side you might want Missouri goldenrod. Asters, another fabulous late season plant. Douglas aster on the west and Eaton's aster on the east. And then thistles, another one where it's the same thistle. I know a lot of people like thistles, aren't they? Nasty invasive weeds. Well, yes, there are some, but I'm not talking about Canada thistle. I'm not talking about milk or bull thistle. This one is edible thistle. And this is one of our native thistles. And because non-native thistles are such a headache, native thistles have got a bad rap too, and often are inadvertently done away with because someone looks at it and goes, ah, thistle. Spray that, dig that. But native thistles are incredibly rich sources of nectar, often flowering late. And so wherever you can, we always encourage native thistles are a good option. And I know that was a lot of information, but don't worry. I have plant lists at the back. We have one for the west side, one for the east. They're at the back. And I apologize, I wasn't expecting this many people, so I didn't bring enough copies for everybody with me this evening, but yeah, they're on the website, exactly. So that information is out there. But also, like I said, there are so many other sources of information on plants that will be totally, you know, suited to your yard and some people who can help. Having said that native is best, and I'm gung-ho encourage native, it's a garden, right? Gardens are there for all sorts of different reasons. We want to throw a ball around, we want our dog to run, we want to sit with our cocktail in the evening or our coffee in the morning. You know, there's lots of things we want from our gardens, and sometimes we just want beauty. And so there are also some fabulous non-native plants that do have some benefits for pollinators, and mostly it's for nectar source and sometimes for the pollen. But things like the purple coneflower, a North American native, but not to this area. So it's what would be called a near native. And those typically will support more species of wildlife than distant natives. So there is a place when these plants are chosen carefully, you can still have a beautiful garden that will support wildlife. And the lower one is a plant called Spanish or French lavender. Most lavenders grow in a wide range of conditions, and this one flowers relatively early in the year and is a rock star for supporting those bumblebees. It's one of those plants that you can hear on occasion before you see it, just because of the bees on it. Another area of our garden, thinking about plants, lawns. Again, you know, maybe ideally you just get rid of your lawn and cover it all with a native prairie. Wouldn't that be glorious? But you may not want that, because you may still want that lawn to entertain, throw a ball around, whatever. So it's a garden, so there's lots of things, but you could also, you can have bloom in your lawn. This is Dutch white clover. Some states this is a noxious weed, but not around here. Having said, it's not a noxious weed in Washington, is it? I just went, oh, I'm on the other side of the river this evening. But anyway, it's one of those plants that is often vilified, you know, and a lot of the kind of lawn care stuff focuses on that immaculate green. No, you've all seen those like Home Depot adverts, you know, and others with just this manicured green carpet. I'm never going to win any prizes for that myself, because those lawns, I mean, we talk about habitat loss. You know, we think of habitat loss and we go, oh, we think of chainsaws and trees coming down and bulldozers for new housing. But there's more than 40 million acres of lawn in this country. And if it's just that kind of stereotypical classic green carpet, that's habitat loss. You support almost no wildlife on one of those. So that's an area of our gardens that we can look at and begin to bring some habitat back into our yards. And sometimes you can like actively sow an eco lawn, and other times it's just what you might call benign neglect. Don't follow all the guidance on herbiciding it and fertilizing it and all that other kind of stuff, and gradually all sorts of interesting things will pop up. There's also a movement called No Mow May. I've been heavily involved with this, but I didn't really set out to be heavily involved. No Mow May began in Britain, just by chance, connection there. But it kind of got kicked off in the United States because of a professor at Appleton University Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin, who spent a few years in Britain. No Mow May, that's great. When I go back to Appleton, I can do it there. And it became this thing, and all of a sudden, people started coming to us and saying, so what's this No Mow May stuff? And we're like, I don't know, but I guess we've got to find out. We also got involved because of Bee City and Bee Campus, which is I'll talk a little more about that later, but that's something that we ran, didn't create it, but now run. And it happened that Appleton and Lawrence were part of that. So of course people came to us and said, well, what are these Bee City people doing with No Mow May? So like, okay. So the basic idea is that you don't mow your lawn for a month, and that lets flowers grow and you get happy bees, which is a lovely, simple concept, but it's not, it's so many things, it's not quite as simple as that. Because from the perspective of bee conservation, simply not mowing your lawn for a few weeks and letting some more weeds grow, that's pretty limited, okay? Dandelions, fascinating plant. They use chemical warfare to suppress other plants. And there is some evidence that they do feed bees and butterflies and some other things. But really, I mean, the end point of conservation should not be growing a non-native invasive plant, right? The end point of conservation really should be supporting our native habitats and bringing more diverse plantings in. So as far as I'm concerned, the best thing about No Mow May is people love their lawns, and as soon as one looks weedy, everybody's up in arms and we can have some great conversations. And it's like, because of that, I've been on Fox News talking about no mow May. But again, it's like one of those things that if we hadn't stepped in, no mow May would just be like going in one direction. So we've taken it and like tried to shift the conversation so that people begin talking about what else you can do in your yard. We talking about the limitation of no mow May. We talk about the benefits you can have from converting lawns into meadows or creating flowers instead of flower borders instead of your lawn everywhere. So from that perspective, no mow May has been incredible. And we did some stats. I mean, like we got 1 billion outreach through the news media one year in May, and it was just like mind blowing. Of course, it doesn't mean that 1 billion people read it. It just means that that was the reach of that media outlet. But it's been really fun from that perspective of beginning to shift the conversation. And now I have heard other people, like there was one mayor of a city in Illinois on television, and I'm like, you've got our talking points, you nailed it. It was great. Anyway, no mow May is one thing you can do, and of course the other thing is reducing the intensity of maintenance and management in your yard. If we can bring some of that chaos and that less intensity in, then we're going to gradually be changing a little by little. It's incremental. It's like it doesn't have to be all or nothing. There's always a halfway point, or a quarter way, or a 10% point. Everything we do to make our gardens better for bees will help bees, and that's always going to be a step forward from where we were. So the other thing we need to think about is those nesting and egg laying sites. These are the places where those bees will be spending a year of their life. So we need those sites, and we need them to be stable. We need those snags that are out there in our landscape currently. Although I'm not going to, if it's in a park by a kid's playground, I'm not going to say, don't cut that snag, because I don't want the kids to get hurt either. Again, there's sensible compromises that can be made everywhere. Where we can keep snags, we should, because they're amazing for all sorts of wildlife, not just bees. Where we can keep bare ground, we should. That lower photograph, that's a golf course. You may be able to see some of the fairways and so on in the background. And the players at that golf course were agitating because they were like, that's ugly, it's weedy, we need to get rid of it. The superintendent contacted me, and I went out and had a look. And over a summer, we found 8 species of bees were nesting in that bank. So what we did, we put a sign up that said, bee nesting site, wildlife area. And some people were like, oh, that's awesome. That's great. Let's keep that. So, sometimes it's just shifting people's mindset, and you can have an impact. So ground nesting, given the importance of ground nesting sites, and given how many of our bees nest in the ground, there's remarkably little information I can give you about how to do this. Some people have tried making bee banks, and I did find a brochure, a fact sheet from Britain just recently, where they had people going out and big mounds of dirt and digging trenches, and this is great, but we don't know for sure if the bees occupy it. So sometimes it's just like, do you want to put that much work in to something that may not bring great benefit? So the most important thing is make sure you have bare ground. And that means don't put bark mulch down everywhere. Use it where it's needed, but don't put it on everything, because the bees need that bare ground. The bees don't need big areas of bare ground. That photograph, you can see there's a concrete path on the lower edge and then a rock above. And that's about 8 or 9 inches between those two, and there's enough dirt there, and if you look, you'll see just under the edge of that rock, you can see little mounds of dirt kicked out, because that's where the bees are nesting. So sometimes it's just this shifting expectations about how you maintain and care for your garden, just to make sure that there is bare ground there. We can be active making nest blocks. You know, I was saying we're not going to keep snags everywhere. Sure, we can create an artificial snag out of lumber, drilling holes in of the right diameter, putting it up, you know, leave it alone. If you do one of these, you know, I personally prefer to put them between about 3 feet and 5 feet off the ground. That's just because it's a really convenient height for me to be able to look at. Either because I can stand there and look, or I can bring my lawn chair up and sit and it's at the right height. Because once you have one of these, it's fascinating watching the bees coming and going. You can see them bringing the nesting materials in. You can watch them bring pollen in on, you know, they carry pollen on the back, on their legs or underside of their abdomen, the back end of their body. They carry nectar in their crop. And so it's like when they're foraging, if they land on the block and go in head first, you know, they're gone into regurgitate the nectar. And then they come out and they turn around and they shuffle in backwards. And that's when they take the pollen off. So you can watch all of this in your own backyard. These do work for sure. You know, there's a mason bee on the lower photo blocking off those canes with dirt. You know when it's been occupied. The upper one is a block sealed with one of the leafcutter bees. The problem with nest blocks is that you create this really significant concentration of bees, and that can lead to more pests and parasites. Sometimes those kleptoparasitic bees will come in, and that's not great for the host bee, although it's really great for the kleptoparasitic bee. And again, I don't want to demonize kleptoparasitic bees because they're bees and we need all bees. This is just part of the nature of being a wildlife gardener, is you end up supporting all wildlife, and that's part of the joy of it. Nest blocks need regular and ongoing maintenance because you do get that buildup of parasites and pests and diseases and fungi and all sorts of nasty stuff. Bees are many different sizes, from 1/8 of an inch long to 3/4 of an inch long. And so they need all sorts of different sized holes, and many of these blocks, particularly the commercial ones, you can't get that range of holes. And many of those bees, you can't open up the nest. If you've studied mason bees, you'll have read about cocoons, etc., etc. Not all bees make cocoons. So you can't open up that nest and then remove the cocoons and clean it, etc. You know, so nest blocks can be great, but you can also make bumblebee nests. Again, as a wooden box or a styrofoam 6-pack cooler or an old teapot, maybe a watering can. There's lots of things you can use to make, you know, provide that cavity. Bit of dry moss in there, maybe. Dryer lint. Do you collect dryer lint? Do you carefully clean your dryer? It's amazing how much of that you can collect, and the bumblebees will be happy with that. And so you can make one of these, but it's a really satisfying project, but maybe only 1 in 5 ever get occupied. So it can be quite a lot of work for not much benefit. And in the end, the best approach, and the approach that we recommend, is try and provide those natural areas. That means your yard is going to start looking a little less like that idealized yard you see in the magazines and on the gardening shows. We can save the stems. I know it's, you know, a little admission here. I started off doing pollinator conservation like 25 years ago, and we were talking about blocks, and it's like, but then when you stop and think about it, out in the wild, in the natural areas, there's not that many horizontal holes, right? Most of these bees are occupying stems, and sometimes that's in a branch, so maybe it's at that angle. Sometimes it's that angle. Sometimes it's a beetle tunnel in a snag, so it might be more horizontal. But a lot of it is these vertical stems. And all of a sudden I'm like, so we've been building all these horizontal things when the bees naturally occupy vertical things. How can we do that? So we can save the stems. So when you come to your end of year garden cleanup, you can keep your secateurs in the shed. Don't worry about it. Leave your plant stems up. the seeds will be there. You'll feed all sorts of birds. It's really cool. I see all sorts of finches and so on, the goldfinches and others in my yard. They just come through and eat the seeds. And then later in the year, once the seeds have gone, you can then get your secateurs out and cut back your yard. I have taken to kind of doing it in 2 stages because there is this element. I live in the suburbs, so there's a little bit of like, what's that crazy guy doing with his messy yard? So I tidy it up a little bit. And then, you know, I'm about to start the real tidy, where I'm going to cut my stems between about 10 inches and 18 inches. And then that'll be the end of my cleanup. And then those stems are where our small mining bees, our leafcutter bees, our yellow-faced bees and others will find the hollow stems, or some of them the carpenter bees will actually chew out their stems. And that's the lower photo here is a small carpenter bee working on its nest. And you do this and, you know, you might be thinking, well, isn't it an eyesore? Well, no, this is the same. You know, the photo on the left there is the stems just after cleaning up. And then it's the same patch later in the year. You wouldn't know the stems were there, but the bees do. And that process is like a 2-year cycle because you cut the stems, the bees occupy them. Through the winter, and then the next year they emerge. So you have to leave the stems for them to emerge. And then you cut your next year's stems will provide fresh nest sites. You can also build log piles, stick piles. You know, if you've got a big yard, you can have a big stick pile. Yay, go for it. If you've got a small yard, you might want to be a little neater and tidier, but it's whatever fits in your yard. And we're just creating these little nooks and crannies. Sometimes you'll find, particularly with the big ones, they may actually be better for bees. The bees will occupy, some of these nesting bees will occupy the ends of the cut stems. There might be cavities in there that bumblebees can occupy for their nest sites and so on. But this is also an area where you'll be supporting so much other wildlife. Lady beetles might overwinter. There are a few butterfly species around here that try to overwinter as adults. You'll get spiders. Can I mention? Yeah, no, of course I mention spiders. Spiders are fabulous, and you shouldn't be worried about them. But this is the kind of place where they'll tuck themselves away. You can also do like rock walls and rock piles. You know, these can be part of your hard landscaping. Instead of doing concrete blocks in lovely serried rows with no gaps, make it a little more, it's rustic, the term to use, but a little less formal. Dry stack walling has all sorts of holes and gaps in it. And those are just the little places that the insects will get in and overwinter and survive. Leaves are a remarkably good resource, incredibly rich in our yard, and we throw them away. So, you know, organic matter for soils, there is evidence coming out, some research projects coming out now which show that where you have retained the leaves, you actually get more carbon capture in the soils, which is really cool because it's like climate change, you know, existential threat. But here's a little thing that we can do that helps capture carbon. Mulch to help retain moisture. Why do you take your leaves away and then bring mulch in? You just keep your leaves. You've got mulch there. This leaf layer also is incredibly rich in insects. Springtails, which are microscopic. You could have as many as 30 or 40,000 springtails in a square yard of leaf litter and topsoil. You can have beetles that will hunt through their fireflies even. I know we don't think of fireflies around here, and it's really sad because the fireflies we have around here don't light up. They're daytime dark fireflies, but we do have fireflies, but they choose to use perfumes basically to communicate and not flash. So I have friends and relatives in Chicago, and it's like they know that when the Brit goes to Chicago, he's going to sit around on the front lawn all night. But that's okay, because they're just like these magical insects. And leaf litter is also an overwintering shelter for our overwintering the queen bumblebees that we want to emerge. So with leaves, it's like with so many things, there's no absolute right or wrong way of doing it. You know, there's no leaf police out there checking to see, do you have leaves and how thick they are and where you're keeping them and how you're managing them. Again, it's this incremental, you know, there must be somewhere in your yard you can keep leaves, right? You don't want to keep them where they're going to be a problem. You know, don't block your drains. Don't create a trip hazard because someone can't see the step. Don't have them where you're going to slide around and fall over. Yeah, and make sure you can see out through your windshield. But there should be somewhere you can keep leaves. Maybe you can put them on a flower border as mulch. Maybe you can, you know, maybe you can mount them at the back of your flower border, up against the base of a hedgerow, the bottom of a fence. There must be places where you can keep these, and by keeping some, and again, not all, and I keep what I can, but there's a couple of big trees around and they dump more leaves on my yard than we can handle. And so I keep them where I can, and then some go. But the richness of wildlife that you get into your garden by hanging onto those leaves is remarkable. I mean, just this morning I was watching song sparrow, golden-crowned sparrow. I was going to say towhee, but it wasn't. It was a juncos. Sorry, were feeding through the leaf litter in my front yard when I watched them for a few minutes. But yeah, I do get juncos and buried thrushes and other things. They come into the garden for the leaf litter. And with many of these things, it's always good to put a sign up. I know they can get the yard by yard sign that tells you all, but you can also get other signs for specific things. You know, pesticide free, leave the leaves, pollinator habitat, what, you know, lots of these things. And it really helps to tell your neighbors that your yard looks the way it does by conscious thought, not by abandonment. You know, there are some communities that have weed ordinances. Some homeowners associations have really rigid expectations about landscapes. And so this is a broader issue as more and more people are wanting to do wildlife gardening, is how do we adjust expectations and how do we make wildlife gardening fit some of the community stuff, because we don't always want to alienate our friends and neighbors. But we found that putting a sign up that says, you know, this landscape looks this way on purpose can reassure people. Pesticides. We could have had someone here to talk all night about pesticides. The most important thing is kind of don't. You know, we can talk about chemistry and impacts and pathways and all sorts of stuff, but the underlying thing is don't. Unless there's an absolute need, try to avoid them. You know, insecticides typically have what's called a bee caution label on them, and those bee caution labels are not necessarily representative of how you can protect our native bees. They'll say things like, don't spray whilst bees are active. So yeah, I mean, that makes sense. Cover the nest. How can you cover a dead tree or your plants or your bare ground? And because most of the bee caution labels are based upon honeybees and beekeeping management, and don't necessarily reflect wild living native species. And that means that even when you follow the label to the T, you also have impacts. The question, yeah.
Well, kind of a general question. I live right next door to a pear orchard and they spray on all the
Yeah.
And I have a strip of land there that I would like to plant stuff. Should I really steer away from doing flowers up there and just put things that the bees won't be attracted to?
I mean, yeah, unfortunately drift from neighboring land is a challenge. You can grow windbreak of you know, conifers, you know, even arborvitae, which is not very exciting, but can grow and create a physical barrier to catch drift.
That's not very exciting, fire zones.
Yeah, no, I realize there's all those challenges.
Yeah.
Um,
So in other words, don't plant pollinating plants. up the
it
top.
may, yeah.
I mean, I have a house and then that's.
Yeah.
kind of a block.
Yeah, it may be sensible to,
What's that?
yeah, the suggestion was late blooming. So
Oh,
so that they're in bloom when things are not being treated next door, and that was a very good suggestion.
I'm doing the same thing, and we live in the same neighborhood. Is there any kind of a classification you can get for starting a heritage garden or something that would push back the barrier from the spray?
Not that I know of. I've never heard of that anywhere.
That would be good.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes sometimes on roadsides you can achieve that just by, you know, like putting up no spray signs. And sometimes organic growers are able to do that, but for gardens, I have not come across that anywhere, I'm afraid. Yeah. I know pesticides is always a gloomy topic. Because the other thing with insecticides now, and this is another reason why those bee caution labels aren't so effective now, is because they were done when most insecticides were applied on the outside of a plant. And now we have neonicotinoids and some more recent chemistries that I can't even start to try and pronounce, that are what are called systemic, which means that they're applied to the plant and they get inside the plant tissues. Sometimes that's by a spray on the outside. Sometimes that's by treating the soil and they get picked up by the roots. But this, from the perspective of plant protection, I mean, that's great because it means every bit of the plant is toxic to what you don't want. But that does mean the nectar and the pollen also carries residues. And some of these residues are significant enough to occasionally cause death, or just change behaviors, impact navigation skills. And if you can't navigate so well and you're a bee trying to get from flower to nest, it slows you down. It can reduce your egg laying ability. So lots of ways in which what I refer to as sublethal impacts from these pesticides affect bees. Yes.
I was gonna ask at the end, right here. In the past, I've asked UCD and River Soil Water Conservation District about some native plants annually, and I've bought from both sides of the river. But the question that I put to both of you is, and I assumed I'd get a yes, was, can you assure me that none of these plants I'm buying for habitat, pollinators, and critters have any systemic insecticides applied to them? And I really couldn't get an answer. I remember I ended up chasing around to various different growers on the Oregon side trying to answer my own question. Can someone from Underwood Conservation answer that for me? Because you don't grow your own plants, set it out, right?
We're starting to grow our own.
Okay,
At the Wind
that's-
River Nursery, that's that
Okay, that's
new
good.
development.
Okay, can somebody answer that definitively yet?
It's not, it's a non-definitive answer. I can look more into it. If you want to reach out, we can talk. That'd be great. Bring that concept up.
Okay, I guess as a buying person who's an environmentalist, I'd like a pretty definitive answer at some point, because it's a concern for all of us. We're buying these plants for habitat. And if we don't know if they've been grown with systemics, I mean, that'd be the worst case. Really?
Yeah, for the most part, and I hope the Zoom folks can hear us, we are buying from native plant nurseries that have the ethic of, promoting native habitat, but we need to probably confirm what you're asking. So
Yeah.
we can try to
put it
follow
in
up.
Write some on the website once you get it sorted, because otherwise we end up chasing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if it's a prolific plant making or a seed making plant, does that carry on to the next generation of the seeds too?
I don't think it's at a level that's significant enough to cause problems for the next generation of plants.
I was gonna ask that for clarification. You might have to buy those plants, but after a year or so, does it matter?
It depends on the plant, sadly. It's like with some, and even when some of the early neonicotinoids were first being developed, the companies did tests that were not released publicly. We managed to get our hands on them through a Freedom of Information request to, I think it was one of the Californian agencies. And even Bayer's own people found that the residues in some shrubs, I think the tests were done on rhododendrons, would last 2 or 3 years after treatment. So it's a headache. It's shrubs that are the ones that seem to be most long lasting. Sometimes there is some evidence of like residues from like more like annual plants that have been grown 1 year and treated. Those residues end up remain in the soil, and that's enough to be picked up by the next year. So yeah, no, and you know, these started being used in the 90s, so like 30 years ago now, and as is the regular problem that everybody else is playing catch up on the manufacturers and the regulators, because once they're out there, it's difficult to call them back. But
Dave Golson's book, Silent Earth, he's
yeah,
done so much work with you know.
yeah, no, yeah, and Dave, I mean, it's like Rachel Carson. When she published Silent Spring, she became a target of the industry. Dave Golson has become a target of the industry, which gives you an idea of just how accurate his writing is. And he's got a series of books, one of which is Silent Earth. He's also done, I think it's Urban Jungle, but then there's another couple of books just about bees, one of which is called the Sting in the Tail and the other one is Buzz in the Meadow. And so he's yeah. And he also writes well, which is good, because some people write, the book's really, you know, the information is really important, but it's really dull to read, you know. But yeah, anyway, so I was going to say this is a displaced problem, and the challenge is finding plants that are safe. But we've just had that conversation, so thank you. I'm glad you brought it up. And I'll mention to you, Tova, now that we are actually working with growers in a number of places to develop nursery protocols for how to create bee safe. We call them bee safe plants, but to how to grow bee safe plants. And we also, one of the things we do is we have what we call habitat kits, not in all regions of the country. And we contract grow native plants that then we give out to local organizations or farmers or gardeners. It varies with the region, and as with so many things, on how we've got the funding and what the funders want. But with those, we contract grow, and part of that growing is specification about pesticide use, because we want those plants to be as safe as possible. And so from that, we are now developing protocols. So yeah, I'll track down the person you should talk to find out more about that, because that may be relevant for you folks. And then the last thing about pesticides, of course, is, you know, there's all these other great insects out there which are going to resolve your majority of pest problems. And because you're growing for pollinators, creating this habitat, it's going to get populated by everything else, whether that's lady beetles, which are so cute and seem innocuous until you see just how savage they are with aphids. And also wasps. I realized I took my wasp photo out with the bee nests, because all the things you're doing to create nests for bees will also support wasps. Bees and wasps are very closely related. They're the same group of insects known as Hymenoptera. And the chances are that if you were to look back at evolution, you'd discover that a bee is just a vegetarian wasp. Okay, which means that in the same way with bees, there are a few social species and most of them are solitary. It's the same with wasps. Most wasps are solitary and they'll be nesting in that mason bee block next to it. If you see long pieces of grass sticking out of a hole, you know, you've got a grass carrier wasp in there. You can watch, this is just such stunning insects, the golden digger wasp, which is huge. No, it's not very big. It's not like huge, but you know what I mean? I mean, it seems like this really big thing and it's so docile. You can just sit there by its nest sites and watch it come and go, taking tree crickets in and out. And it's just, anyway, so all these other wildlife will come in and you'll get this balance. And in the end, your yard is going to look tatty. It's going to be chewed on. It'll be dug out. But you should sit back and celebrate because that is a sign of success. This is what you are working for. That upper photograph is a leafcutter bee on redbud. You can see all the little pieces of leaf that it's taken out to make its nest. The bottom one is a little baby monarch caterpillar on milkweed. Imagine if that milkweed had been treated for pests. Many pests are moths or butterflies. And so we need to be keeping our landscapes safe and diverse and enjoy them and celebrate when you have the wildlife you want. Just to skim through for the last few slides, some other things to consider. There are things you can do in your garden that kind of makes your garden part of a bigger thing. Some of the individual actions that you can do include participating in community science, or also known as participatory science projects. Some of them, like there's like Bumblebee Watch. Just take photographs of the bumblebees on your phone and upload them, and that helps build an ever larger database of which species are where, and which flowers they're using, and all of that helps build knowledge and makes conservation advice and conservation information better. You can report sightings of monarchs at any life stage or milkweed plants that you have growing, and it helps us build that understanding of where monarchs are migrating across the landscape. Because we know where monarchs spend the winter, we kind of know where they go in the summer, but we don't know. It's hundreds of thousands of miles, so we're learning. There's also like Journey North that specializes in monarchs and also hummingbirds and tracking of spring as it travels northwards. There's Project Monarch Health, another monarch-focused one. There's a great sunflower project run from Gretchen LeBoon in San Francisco, and it's great. What she asks you to do is to go and look at some flowers for about half an hour and just count how many bees you have. And it's great. It's lovely. It's a lovely, like Saturday morning, sunny morning with your morning coffee activity. And then there's iNaturalist, which is so many people use now, and many scientists and researchers and other organizations, because it's incredibly rich database of information, and we can mine that. We can get information about movement, and it's like we've now, thanks to iNaturalist, we're discovering that the eastern carpenter bee has now got as far as eastern Washington. It used to only be known like from the east. That's why it's called the eastern carpenter bee. And it seems to be migrating and moving, and no one's quite sure, but we have records of a new bee species arriving in this region. And so there's all these ways in which you can contribute to building knowledge and understanding. We also have our Bring Back the Pollinators campaign and the Pollinator Protection Pledge. You commit to following the principles of pollinator-friendly flowers, nest sites, avoid pesticides, and share the word. And share the word can be as simple as putting a sign up. That painted rock I had as a sort of section break, that's from someone's garden. That's sharing the word. All you're doing is you're saying, yep, this is for wildlife. Or you can share the word by writing opinion pieces to your local papers or waving placards around outside. You know, there's lots of different ways of doing it. but it's whatever you feel comfortable with. You can also take action at the community or collective action at the community level. I mentioned Bee City USA earlier, and it's a sister program, Bee Campus USA. And it's the same principles of, you know, creating habitat, cutting back on pesticides and doing outreach. But it's something that the community can commit to. There are a few brochures I brought with more information, or you can go to the website. One reason I love Bee City is we do, as I said, we now run Bee City. We didn't create it. That was Phyllis Stiles in Asheville, North Carolina, who created it. Although she did talk to us early on, which was nice. And when her husband was insisting that she retired, because she was running this all as a volunteer, and he was like, no, we need to do retirement properly now. And so she came to us and asked whether we would take it over from her. And we said, of course, yes, because we think it's wonderful. So we've been running it for 6 years now, and there's 427 communities now across the country that are part of this network. And although we have these basic requirements, it's up to the community what they want to do. You might focus on prairies, or, you know, pollinator garden tour, or, you know, there's one city that really loves doing its annual pub crawl. They call Get Buzzed for the Bees. Like, okay. That's not one we highlight a lot in our outreach, because we're like, anyway. But there's so many things, and it's just fabulous to see the creativity and the imagination, the dedication and the hard work of these people, and they're having fun while they're doing it. And then a few resources. There's books. These are all from the Xerces Society. You can get them from your library. You can get them from wherever you like to have books from. You can get them from us for a donation, but I can tell you, way cheaper from a bookstore. Although I shouldn't say that, should I? I should say. Anyway, you can also go to our website, and that was already mentioned. Everything I brought with me this evening is also, everything. Yes, I think everything you can download from our website, but the important stuff like nests and pesticides and plant lists and so on, you can get from our website. You can listen to me whilst you're gardening if you want, because we have a podcast now called Bug Banter that's just over a year old, and I happen to co-host it. But we talk about all sorts of invertebrate related conservation issues. Sometimes it's gardening, sometimes it's like, how can we change state legislation? We recorded one earlier today all about EPA and how we can get them to change how they regulate pesticides to make them more sensible. You can also go to YouTube, inevitably, in addition to the Conservation District's webinars that you can watch. You'll find lots of stuff on our YouTube and social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky. Those are our 3 platforms. So you can go there, you can find information, get updates and news, and ask us questions. And did I mention we were donor supported? I think I did. Well, thank you. I realize we're nearly out of time, so of course, yeah. No, I'm happy to take questions. I don't want to have people stay late.
If you could restate questions.
Yes, of course.
Is it true, was Albert Einstein ever said, did he ever say that if all the bees in the world were to disappear, that virtually all the humans would disappear about 4 years later?
Yeah, I'm just going to repeat that so the people at home will have heard. The question was, is it true that Albert Einstein said that if all the bees disappear, humans will soon follow? No. Not so far as I know, because it was a really, wouldn't it be wonderful if he did? But it just seems to be one of those tales now. Even the Einstein archive, which I believe is in Austria, has spent some time trying to work that out, and no one can find any reference to it. So, sorry. There are many other inspirational quotes about pollinators that I could share, but not that one.
So
Well, we cleared the room quickly.
Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. We can have one-on-one questions.
Yeah,
here.
of course. Yep. I'm happy to stay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining. If
Yeah.
anyone has questions, we can help answer them now too.